Life after 70 isn't about accumulating more. It's about letting go of what no longer serves you. I remember visiting my neighbor Martha last year. At 82, she lived in a beautiful home filled with decades of possessions, achievements, and memories. I should be happy, she told me, gesturing around her immaculate living room. I have everything I worked for. Yet the heaviness in her voice was unmistakable. 3 months later, I visited Martha again. Half her possessions were gone. Her schedule, once packed with obligations, had been drastically simplified. I feel like I can breathe again, she said, with a lightness I'd never seen in her before. Now, before you think this is just another video about decluttering your closets or donating old clothes, it's not. What I'm talking about goes much deeper than physical possessions. The shocking truth is that most seniors are drowning in possessions. Yes, but also in habits, relationships, and mindsets that are actively robbing them of happiness. While everyone's focused on what to add to their lives, more savings, more activities, more security, I'm here to tell you something completely different. The secret to thriving in your golden years lies in what you eliminate. What if I told you that the difference between merely existing and truly living after 70 comes down to just 5 things you need to throw away? 5 things that most retirement experts never talk about? In my decades working with thousands of seniors, I've witnessed a pattern so clear it can't be ignored. Those who find genuine peace and happiness in their later years aren't those with the biggest savings or the most lavish lifestyles. They're the ones who had the courage to let go. Take Frank, for instance. At 75, he was wealthy by any standard, successful career, perfect retirement plan, beautiful vacation home. He did everything the financial advisors said. Yet when I met him, he confessed he felt emptier than ever. It wasn't until he released something he'd been carrying for decades, something we'll discuss today, that he finally found the contentment he'd been chasing. Or consider Elaine, who at 84 has more energy and joy than most people half her age. Her secret isn't some superfood or exercise routine. It's what she deliberately chose to eliminate from her life at 71 that transformed everything. Today, I'm going to reveal these 5 critical things you must eliminate after 70. Some of these might shock you. Some might even make you uncomfortable. But I promise you this, by the end of this video, you'll understand why holding on to these 5 things is the single biggest mistake most seniors make. This isn't about depriving yourself. It's not about minimalism for minimalism's sake. It's about making room for what truly matters in this precious chapter of life. This isn't just another feel-good retirement video. This is about radical transformation at a time when most people think it's too late for change. Ready to discover what's been silently sabotaging your golden years? Let's dive in. Before we dive into the 5 things you need to let go of, let's talk about why this conversation matters so deeply. Did you know that according to research from Stanford Center on Longevity, only 27% of Americans over 70 report feeling very satisfied with their lives? That's despite all the retirement planning, despite the Medicare coverage, despite the senior discounts and golden anniversary celebrations. The truth is, traditional retirement advice has failed millions of seniors. We've been told to focus on financial security, health maintenance, and maybe taking up a hobby or 2. Important? Absolutely, but woefully incomplete. I've spent the last 22 years working with seniors from all walks of life, from former CEOs to school teachers, from those with extensive wealth to those living modestly on Social Security. And I've noticed something fascinating. The level of peace and fulfillment they experience has surprisingly little to do with their bank accounts or even their physical health. Take Dorothy, for example. At 78, she struggles with arthritis that limits her mobility, and she lives on a fixed income that doesn't allow for luxuries. Yet when you walk into her apartment, you're immediately struck by the sense of peace and joy that radiates from her. I used to think I needed more to be happy, she told me. Now I know I needed less. Compare that to Richard, whose retirement portfolio would make financial planners weep with joy. He's physically fit, travels extensively, and by all external measures is living the retirement dream. Yet when we speak privately, he confesses to a persistent emptiness he can't seem to shake. What's the difference? It comes down to what they're carrying and what they've decided to put down. Now, when I talk about throwing away certain things, I'm not suggesting you take a minimalist approach to everything in your life. This isn't about getting rid of cherished mementos or simplifying just for simplicity's sake. Many of my clients initially worry that letting go means losing a part of themselves or erasing their history. Nothing could be further from the truth. This process is about intentional living, about making conscious choices regarding what you carry forward into this chapter of life and what you finally set down. It's about liberation, not deprivation. Dr. Laura Carstensen from Stanford University has spent decades studying aging and happiness. Her research shows something remarkable. As we age, our perspective naturally shifts toward prioritizing emotionally meaningful experiences and relationships. Yet many seniors resist this natural wisdom, clinging to outdated metrics of success and fulfillment. I see this resistance every day in my practice. John, a former marketing executive, spent 3 years after retirement, still checking industry news obsessively, maintaining professional memberships he didn't need, and feeling increasingly irrelevant. "I know I should let it go," he told me, "but who am I without it?" 6 months later, after working through the first item on our list today, John reported a breakthrough. For the first time in my adult life, he said, "I feel like I'm living as myself, not as my resume." That's the transformation that's possible for you too. And it begins with recognizing these 5 things that may be silently draining your capacity for joy, peace, and fulfillment in your golden years. So let's get started with the first, and perhaps most challenging, thing you need to throw away after 70, your outdated self-identity. The first thing you need to throw away after 70 is your outdated self-identity. That rigid perception of who you are based on what you've done, the roles you've played, or the status you've held. For decades, you likely introduced yourself by your profession. I'm a doctor, I'm a teacher, I'm a business owner. Your identity was wrapped up in what you did, how others perceived you, or your role in your family. You were the breadwinner, the caregiver, the problem solver, the go-to person. Let me tell you about George. For 42 years, George was a respected federal judge. His identity was completely fused with his position. The authority, the respect, the intellectual challenges. When he retired at 73, he kept his professional books, maintained subscriptions to legal journals, and even kept wearing his formal clothes around the house. "I feel like an imposter," he confided during our first meeting. "Everyone still calls me judge, but I'm not judging anything anymore. I don't know who I am if I'm not on the bench." This is more common than you might think. A study from the University of Michigan found that seniors who strongly identified with previous professional roles showed higher rates of depression and anxiety after retirement. The researchers called this identity foreclosure, the inability to envision yourself beyond the roles that previously defined you. The science behind this is fascinating. When we cling to outdated identities, our brains remain locked in patterns that resist our current reality. We literally create neural pathways of resistance rather than adaptation. Dr. Gene Cohen, a pioneer in geriatric psychiatry, called this psychological calcification, becoming rigid in how we see ourselves just when we need flexibility the most. Now contrast George's experience with Diane's. After 35 years as an elementary school principal, Diane faced the same identity challenge. But instead of clinging to her former role, she made a conscious decision to release it. "I realized I wasn't losing who I was," she told me. "I was freeing myself to discover who I could still become." Diane didn't deny her past. She still values her education career and mentors new principals occasionally. But she stopped introducing herself as a retired principal and started saying simply, "I'm Diane." She donated her collection of educational leadership books, keeping only a few special volumes. She redirected her organizational skills toward her community garden instead of school committees. The transformation was remarkable. Within a year, she discovered a talent for watercolor painting she never knew she had. She developed new friendships outside education circles. Most importantly, she reported a sense of lightness and possibility that had been missing in her final working years. "I'm not defined by what I did anymore," she said. I'm defined by who I am and what I'm becoming. This doesn't mean erasing your past or denying your accomplishments. Your experiences have shaped you in valuable ways. But there's a profound difference between honoring your history and being imprisoned by it. Here's how to start releasing an outdated self-identity. First, practice introducing yourself without reference to your former occupation or primary role. Simply use your name, or perhaps mention current interests instead of past achievements. Second, examine your living space. Are you maintaining professional libraries, equipment, or credentials you no longer need? Consider which items truly serve your present life and which merely preserve a fading identity. Third, pay attention to your conversation patterns. If you find yourself frequently beginning sentences with "when I was a," or "in my day we always," you might be anchoring yourself to the past rather than engaging with the present. Finally, get curious about who you are at your core, beyond titles, roles, and accomplishments. What values have remained constant throughout your life? What gives you joy regardless of external validation? These elements form your authentic identity, which never expires. Remember Martha from our introduction? Her breakthrough came when she finally donated her massive collection of business suits and professional awards. "I was keeping them like some kind of proof that I mattered," she said. "Now I realize I don't need to prove anything to anyone, including myself." Releasing your outdated self-identity doesn't diminish who you've been. It creates space for who you're becoming. And that evolution doesn't end at 70, 80, or ever, as long as you're willing to let go of the identity that no longer serves the person you are today. The second thing to throw away after 70 is rigid routines and expectations about how life should be. Think about this for a moment. How often do you find yourself saying, "That's not how I've always done it," or "in my day, things were done properly"? How frequently do you feel disappointed because your days aren't unfolding the way you expected them to? I met Harold when he was 76 and deeply frustrated with his life. A former military officer, Harold ran his retirement like he ran his battalion, with precision, structure, and strict adherence to schedule. Every day was meticulously planned. Breakfast at 7 a.m. sharp, newspaper from 7:30 to 8:15, exercise from 8:30 to 9:15, and so on. "It's worked for me my entire life," he insisted. Discipline and routine are the foundations of success. Yet Harold wasn't thriving. When his arthritis flared up, disrupting his exercise routine, he'd become irritable for days. When his grandchildren visited spontaneously, he struggled to enjoy their company because they'd thrown off his schedule. When his favorite breakfast place closed, he spent weeks complaining rather than finding a new option. Harold's rigid routines had served him well during his career, but in retirement, they had become a prison, not a comfort. The science behind this is clear. Research from North Carolina State University found that seniors with high psychological flexibility, the ability to adapt to changing circumstances and adjust expectations, reported significantly higher life satisfaction and lower rates of depression than those with rigid mindsets. Dr. Susan Charles at UC Irvine has studied emotional regulation across the lifespan. Her research shows that as we age, our ability to pivot and adapt becomes increasingly important for emotional well-being. Yet ironically, many people become more set in their ways precisely when flexibility would benefit them most. Now, contrast Harold with Josephine, an 81-year-old former nurse I worked with. Josephine had survived the loss of her husband, a major house fire, and a serious health scare. Through it all, she maintained a remarkable sense of peace. "My secret," she told me once, "I wake up each morning and say to myself, something unexpected will happen today, and that's okay." Josephine wasn't disorganized. She kept a calendar and enjoyed certain routines, but she held them loosely. When her arthritis made her beloved gardening difficult, she didn't abandon it entirely as Harold might have. Instead, she adapted, switching to raised beds and container gardening. When her neighborhood became too noisy, instead of complaining endlessly about how quiet it used to be, she found joy in her noise-canceling headphones and discovered podcasts. "At my age," she said with a wink, Plan B is often better than Plan A anyway. This willingness to adapt rather than resist changed circumstances doesn't just improve daily happiness. It may actually extend your life. The famous Harvard study of adult development, which has followed participants for over 80 years, found that adaptability is one of the strongest predictors of both longevity and life satisfaction in older adults. So how do you begin to release rigid routines and expectations? Start by identifying one area where you tend to be inflexible, perhaps your morning routine, your expectations about family visits, or how certain tasks must be done. Then deliberately introduce a small variation. Eat breakfast 30 minutes later. Try a new route to your regular destination. Use your non-dominant hand for a simple task. These small exercises in flexibility build the mental muscles needed for bigger adaptations. They teach your brain that change doesn't have to be threatening. Next, examine your should statements. Whenever you catch yourself thinking, this should be different, or they should know better, pause and ask, is this expectation serving me or straining me? Often, our suffering comes not from circumstances themselves, but from our rigid expectations about them. I remember Eleanor, a client who was perpetually disappointed by her adult children's infrequent calls. They should call their mother every Sunday, she insisted. That's how I was raised. When we explored this rigid expectation, Eleanor realized she was measuring her family against an outdated standard that didn't account for their busy lives or different communication styles. Once she released her specific expectations about how and when they should connect, she was able to appreciate the text messages, impromptu video calls, and photo updates that actually were coming her way. I was so busy being disappointed about what wasn't happening on Sunday that I missed what was happening on Tuesday and Thursday, she admitted with newfound clarity. To be clear, releasing rigid routines doesn't mean living in chaos. It doesn't mean abandoning all structure or having no expectations whatsoever. It means holding your patterns and preferences with an open hand rather than a clenched fist. It means recognizing the difference between comforting rituals and limiting restrictions. As one 92-year-old client beautifully put it, I used to have routines I couldn't break. Now, I have rhythms I don't want to break, but I could if I needed to. That's the difference. By throwing away rigid routines and inflexible expectations after 70, you're not discarding order or standards. You're embracing the freedom to flow with life's changes rather than fighting against them. And in that flexibility, you'll discover a resilience and peace that no perfect schedule could ever provide. The third thing to throw away after 70 is toxic relationships and unnecessary social obligations that drain your energy rather than enhance your life. This might be the most challenging item on our list for many of you. We're raised to value loyalty, to maintain family connections, and to not rock the boat. But here's a truth that becomes increasingly important as we age. Your time and emotional energy are your most precious and limited resources. Consider Barbara's story. At 74, she was exhausted from maintaining relationships with people who left her feeling depleted. Every month, she had lunch with former colleagues who spent the entire time gossiping and complaining. Every holiday, she endured visits from relatives who criticized her home, her cooking, and her lifestyle. Every week, she fielded calls from a neighbor who dumped emotional problems on her without ever asking how she was doing. But these are long-standing relationships, she told me. I can't just end them. That would be selfish. When I asked her how she felt after these interactions, her answer was revealing. Honestly, like I need a nap. Sometimes I feel so drained, I need days to recover. What Barbara was describing wasn't connection, it was depletion. And science confirms its impact. A landmark study from Harvard Medical School found that negative social interactions actually increase inflammation markers in older adults, potentially accelerating age-related health decline. In contrast, positive social connections were linked to better immune function, lower blood pressure, and even reduced cognitive decline. The quality of your relationships literally affects how your body ages. Now meet Robert, an 82-year-old who made deliberate choices about his social circle after turning 70. I decided my time was too valuable to spend with people who don't lift my spirits, he explained. Robert didn't abruptly cut people off. Instead, he gradually reduced time with energy-draining acquaintances while deepening relationships that brought him joy. He declined committee positions that felt like obligations rather than opportunities. He limited visits with a critical relative to short, public meetings rather than extended homestays. Most importantly, he stopped apologizing for these boundaries. "I used to think setting limits made me selfish," he said. "Now I understand it makes me sustainable." The transformation in Robert's well-being was remarkable. His blood pressure improved, his sleep quality increased, and rather than having less connection, he actually developed deeper, more meaningful relationships with the people who truly enhance his life. This isn't about becoming antisocial or isolating yourself. Human connection remains vital throughout our lives. A meta-analysis of 148 studies found that strong social relationships increase survival odds by 50%, comparable to quitting smoking. But the key factor was the quality of these connections, not the quantity. So how do you begin this process of relationship curation? Start by conducting an honest assessment. After each social interaction, ask yourself, do I feel energized or depleted by this encounter? Keep a simple journal if it helps. Look for patterns over a few weeks. Next, categorize your relationships. Some are core connections that sustain you. Others are positive but peripheral. Some are neutral, and some are consistently draining. Your approach to each category should differ. For those draining relationships, consider whether they can be improved through honest conversation. Sometimes, simply expressing your needs can transform an interaction. Other times, you may need to create distance, reducing frequency, setting time limits, or meeting in settings that feel more comfortable. This applies equally to social obligations. Martha, whom we met earlier, realized she was serving on 3 community boards out of habit rather than passion. "I was afraid they'd think less of me if I stepped down," she admitted. "But when I finally did, all I felt was relief, and suddenly I had energy for the one volunteer role I truly loved." Family relationships often present the greatest challenge. Cultural expectations run deep, and disengaging completely may not be an option or desire. But even here, boundaries are possible. Take Esther, whose weekly family dinners have become tense and argumentative, centered around political disagreements. Rather than abandoning family connection altogether, she reimagined the gatherings, organizing them around activities like cooking classes or photo album organizing that minimize conflict and maximize positive engagement. "We still have our differences," she acknowledged, "but now we interact in ways that remind us why we matter to each other." If you're struggling with guilt about setting boundaries, remember this. Maintaining relationships that consistently undermine your well-being doesn't serve anyone. It doesn't serve you, and ultimately, it doesn't serve them either. Authentic connection can't thrive where resentment and exhaustion reside. As one wise client put it, "I realized at 75 that I don't have time for relationships that require me to be less than who I truly am or more than what I can sustainably give." By thoughtfully releasing toxic relationships and unnecessary obligations after 70, you aren't diminishing your social world. You're refining it. You're creating space for connections that truly nourish your spirit and contribute to your well-being. And in doing so, you're honoring both yourself and the meaningful relationships that remain. The fourth thing to throw away after 70 is the someday mentality. Those postponed dreams and experiences you've been saving for the perfect moment. For decades, many of us operated under the assumption that there would always be time later. "I'll travel when I retire. I'll learn piano after the kids are grown. I'll write that book someday when things settle down." We deferred joy and passion, believing we were making the responsible choice. Then suddenly, we find ourselves at 70, 75, or 80, still saying someday. Only now, the horizon has unmistakably shortened. Ruth's story illustrates this perfectly. I met her when she was 77, a successful former accountant who had lived her entire life by the book. She raised her children, saved diligently for retirement, and followed all the conventional wisdom about financial planning. "I did everything right," she told me during our first session, her voice tinged with unexpected sadness. I delayed gratification. I was responsible. When I asked about her dreams, Ruth pulled out a journal. Inside were lists, places she wanted to visit, skills she wanted to learn, experiences she hoped to have. Most entries had been written decades earlier. I always thought there would be time, she said quietly. But now my knees hurt when I walk. My husband doesn't like to travel anymore, and I'm wondering if I waited too long. Ruth was experiencing what gerontologists call life review regret, the painful recognition of roads not taken and joys unnecessarily deferred. Research from Cornell University found that when older adults were asked about their regrets, the most common responses weren't about mistakes made, but about experiences postponed or avoided altogether. Interestingly, postponed dreams can actually affect physical health. Studies show that having purpose and anticipation improves immune function, cardiovascular health, and cognitive resilience in older adults. When we stop looking forward to experiences, our bodies and minds can begin to decline more rapidly. Compare Ruth's experience with Peter's. At 72, Peter reviewed his own someday list and made a decision. Someday is today. Despite modest finances, Peter prioritized his long-deferred passion for music. He didn't wait for ideal circumstances. He simply began. He found a piano teacher willing to work with arthritic fingers. He joined a seniors choir that accommodated his limited vocal range. When full-scale travel proved too challenging, he explored remarkable destinations within a day's drive of his home. I realized I was waiting for conditions that might never arrive, he explained. Perfect health, unlimited funds, ideal companions. But I didn't need perfect conditions. I just needed to begin. 3 years later, Peter plays piano for his own enjoyment, has explored dozens of local wonders he once overlooked, and describes himself as more alive than I've been in decades. The key difference between Ruth and Peter wasn't circumstance, it was mindset. Peter released the all-or-nothing thinking that kept his dreams perpetually in the future. He embraced what psychologists call modified expectation, adjusting the form but preserving the essence of his aspirations. So how can you release the someday mentality that might be holding your joy hostage? Start by retrieving your postponed dreams, literally. Write down the experiences, skills, or connections you've been deferring. Be specific, not just travel, but see the northern lights or learn about my ancestry in Sicily. Next, for each item, ask yourself, what's the essence of this dream? Is it beauty, learning, connection, adventure? Understanding the core desire helps you find accessible ways to honor it. Then, identify one small, immediate step toward each dream. If you've always wanted to write, start with 10 minutes each morning. Not the perfect writing retreat. If you've longed to see Paris, but health limitations make that difficult, begin with French films, cuisine, or virtual tours that capture elements of the experience. Henry, an 85-year-old client with limited mobility, had always dreamed of seeing the world's great museums. Rather than abandoning this aspiration, he embraced virtual reality technology that allowed immersive museum experiences from his armchair. It's not exactly the same, he acknowledged, but the beauty and learning I wanted are there. Margaret, at 79, had postponed learning to paint for decades. When arthritis made fine brushwork challenging, rather than abandoning her dream, she discovered pour painting, an approach that accommodated her physical limitations while still allowing creative expression. The specific technique doesn't matter, she told me. The joy of creating does. This isn't about lowering standards or settling for less. It's about recognizing that the perfect version of your dream shouldn't be the enemy of a meaningful version that's accessible now. It also means releasing the idea that dreams need grand gestures or extensive resources. Jean, widowed at 76, had always wanted to impact children's lives, but assumed volunteering at schools required energy she no longer had. Instead, she began writing encouraging notes to her neighbors' children before tests and performances. This simple act fulfilled her desire to nurture the next generation in a sustainable way. It isn't the scale of what you do, she reflected. It's the intention behind it. Perhaps most importantly, Throwing away the someday mentality means embracing what is possible in this season rather than lamenting what might have been possible in another. It means recognizing that while some doors may have closed, others have opened that weren't available to you before. As 83-year-old David told me after finally pursuing his interest in local history, I couldn't have done this in my 40s. I didn't have the perspective, the patience, or the freedom. This is the right time for this particular dream. By releasing postponed dreams, not abandoning them, but bringing them into today in whatever form is now possible, you reclaim your right to anticipation, learning, and joy. You remind yourself that growth and experience aren't just for the young. They're the birthright of every human at every stage of life. The fifth and final thing to throw away after 70 is fear-based decision-making. That habit of letting worry rather than wisdom guide your choices. As we age, it's natural for certain fears to intensify. Fear of falling, fear of dependency, fear of loss, fear of being a burden. These concerns aren't irrational. They reflect real possibilities in later life. But when fear becomes the primary driver of your decisions, it doesn't protect you. It diminishes you. I witnessed this transformation in William, a vibrant 74-year-old who had always been adventurous. After a minor fall that resulted in a sprained wrist, his daughter noticed a profound shift in his behavior. He stopped walking in his beloved park, fearing another fall. He declined social invitations, worried about navigating unfamiliar environments. He even stopped volunteering at the library, concerned that he might not be able to handle an emergency. "I'm just being careful," he insisted when I first met him. "That's what you're supposed to do at my age, right?" But William wasn't just being careful. He was shrinking his life. And paradoxically, this retreat didn't make him safer. It made him more vulnerable. Research from the University of Michigan shows that older adults who restrict activities due to fear actually increase their fall risk as muscle strength and balance decline for disuse. Fear-based isolation also accelerates cognitive decline and increases vulnerability to depression. Contrast William's approach with Helen's. At 88, Helen had experienced her share of health challenges, including recovering from a broken hip. Yet her decision-making process remained remarkably balanced. "Of course I consider the risks," she explained. "Then I consider the cost of missing out. Both sides matter." Helen used walking poles to maintain her garden hobby. She arranged transportation to continue her book club when night driving became difficult. When traveling became too challenging, she hosted international students who brought the world to her home. What distinguished Helen's approach wasn't recklessness. It was perspective. She assessed risks realistically but gave equal weight to what psychologists call the costs of avoidance. She understood that safety without engagement isn't really living. The science supports Helen's balanced approach. A landmark study published in the Journal of the American Geriatric Society found that older adults who maintained engagement in meaningful activities, even when modification was needed, showed better functional outcomes and higher quality of life than those who abandoned activities due to fear, even when controlling for actual health status. So how do you begin shifting from fear-based to wisdom-based decision-making? Start by bringing awareness to your thought patterns. When facing a decision, notice whether your thoughts begin with "what if something goes wrong?" or "what if I miss this opportunity?" Both perspectives contain important information. Next, practice what geriatric psychologists call accurate risk assessment. This means evaluating concerns based on probability rather than possibility. Many fears are based on what might possibly happen, even when the probability is quite low. Ask yourself, based on my actual experience, not worst-case scenarios, how likely is this negative outcome? Richard, an 81-year-old client, was reluctant to join a senior hiking group despite his love for nature. What if I can't keep up? What if I hold everyone back? When he examined his actual fitness level and the group's explicitly welcoming policy toward varied abilities, he realized his fears reflected anxiety about social judgment more than physical reality. Another effective approach is to reframe safety itself. Safety isn't just protection from physical harm. It's also protection from regret, isolation, and the erosion of purpose. True safety balances physical well-being with emotional and spiritual well-being. For Isabella, 79, this meant redefining driving safety. While she recognized that night driving had become risky, completely giving up her car keys would have cut her off from vital community connections. Her wisdom-based solution? Limiting driving to daylight hours and familiar routes, while arranging alternatives for other situations. I'm safely maintaining my independence, she explained, rather than safely becoming isolated. Perhaps most importantly, releasing fear-based decision-making means reconnecting with your core values. What has mattered most throughout your life? What makes a day meaningful to you? When decisions align with these deeper values, fear becomes just one factor to consider, not the controlling factor. Thomas, 86, had always valued learning and connection. When declining mobility made his volunteer work at the museum difficult, fear whispered that he should withdraw entirely. Instead, Thomas asked a different question: how can I continue to serve my values within my current reality? This led him to an online role, mentoring younger volunteers from home, preserving the essence of what mattered to him in a new form. To be absolutely clear, throwing away fear-based decision-making doesn't mean throwing away caution or denying limitations. It doesn't mean taking unnecessary risks or ignoring medical advice. Helen still used her walking poles. Isabella still limited her driving. Thomas still acknowledged his mobility challenges. What they threw away wasn't reasonable caution. It was the paralyzing anticipation of what might go wrong that prevented them from experiencing what could go right. As one 92-year-old client beautifully summarized, "At my age, playing it too safe is actually the riskiest choice of all. Time is too precious to spend it hiding from life." By releasing fear-based decision-making after 70, you reclaim your right to balance choices that protect not just your physical safety, but your joy, purpose, and connection. You acknowledge that wisdom isn't just about avoiding harm. It's about embracing what makes life worth living, even when doing so requires courage. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, this all sounds nice in theory, but what about the practical realities of aging? What about my fixed income, my health limitations, my family responsibilities? These are valid questions. Letting go of these 5 things doesn't mean ignoring real-world constraints. It means operating within them more effectively and with greater joy. Let's address some common concerns I hear whenever I discuss these principles. But what about my financial limitations? Money constraints are real for many seniors. Social Security checks don't stretch as far as they used to. Healthcare costs continue to rise. For Martha, whom we met earlier, living on a teacher's pension meant careful budgeting. At first, I thought my limited finances meant I couldn't release my fear-based thinking or pursue postponed dreams, she told me. Then I realized that creative approaches cost nothing. Martha found free community concerts instead of expensive shows. She joined a walking group rather than a costly gym. She discovered her library offered language classes she'd always wanted to take. Her financial situation hadn't changed, but her perception of what was possible within those constraints had expanded dramatically. What about physical limitations and health concerns? This is perhaps the most significant concern. Physical challenges are real, and they can intensify with age. But here's what I've observed. Accepting physical limitations and abandoning joy are 2 very different things. Joseph, at 84, couldn't hike mountains anymore due to COPD. But rather than abandoning his love of nature, he found accessible viewpoints where he could drive, sit comfortably, and experience the vistas he loved. His condition hadn't changed, but his approach to working within its boundaries had evolved. "I can't do everything," he said, "but I can still do something, and that something still matters." What about cherished memories and keepsakes? When I talk about releasing outdated identities or rigid routines, some worry this means erasing precious memories or discarding meaningful keepsakes. Not all. Elena, a 77-year-old widow, kept her husband's favorite chair and the wedding photo on her nightstand. What she released were the rooms full of his untouched belongings that had become a shrine, preventing her from creating a new life. I'm not dishonoring his memory by moving forward, she realized. The best parts of our life together live in my heart, not in his closet full of old suits. Isn't this approach too radical for someone my age? Many assume that significant life changes are for the young, that after a certain age, we should simply accept things as they are. This perspective ignores the remarkable capacity for growth that continues throughout life. Research from the Berlin Aging Study shows that personality can continue to develop and evolve well into our 80s and beyond. The human capacity for adaptation doesn't disappear with age. Sometimes it even deepens. As Dr. Gene Cohen famously observed in his groundbreaking work on aging, aging is not lost youth, but a new stage of opportunity and strength. Consider Grace, who at 91 decided to release toxic relationships that had drained her for decades. My friends were shocked, she told me. They said, at your age, why rock the boat? But I asked myself, if not now, when? The truth is, these principles can be applied gradually at your own pace. You don't need to transform everything overnight. Start with one area that resonates most strongly. Take small steps. Notice the results. Maria began simply by declining one weekly obligation that had become a burden rather than a joy. Frank started by spending 15 minutes each morning pursuing a postponed interest in watercolor painting. These modest beginnings led to more significant shifts as they experienced the benefits. But what about my responsibilities to others? Many seniors are caregivers for spouses, adult children, or grandchildren. These responsibilities are real and meaningful. Yet even within these commitments, there's room for reclaiming joy and purpose. Sophia, 76, was raising her teenage granddaughter after her daughter's death. I thought releasing my fixed routines or pursuing my interests would be selfish, she admitted. But when she enrolled in a weekly art class, arranging for her granddaughter to spend that time with a trusted friend, something unexpected happened. I became a better grandmother, she realized. Having that time to refill my cup made me more patient, more present when I was with her. The evidence is clear. These principles of letting go don't work despite real-world constraints. They work within them. They don't require perfect health, unlimited funds, or freedom from responsibility. They simply require willingness to examine what you're carrying and ask whether it still serves the life you want to live now. As Robert, 88, put it, I spent decades accumulating money, possessions, accomplishments, obligations. It took me until 75 to realize that the richest years would come from thoughtfully letting things go. I've worked with seniors from all walks of life, wealthy and struggling, healthy and chronically ill, independent and caregiving. While their specific circumstances varied enormously, the principles remained consistently powerful across these differences. What unites the stories of Martha, Joseph, Helen, and all the others we've discussed isn't privilege or extraordinary circumstances. It's simply the courage to release what no longer serves them and embrace what does, regardless of their starting point. That same opportunity awaits you, exactly where you are, with exactly the resources and limitations you currently have. We began this journey with a bold statement. After 70, throwing away 5 specific things can transform your experience of your golden years. We've explored each one: outdated self-identity, rigid routines and expectations, toxic relationships and obligations, postponed dreams, and fear-based decision-making. These aren't physical possessions that clutter your closets. They're internal and relational burdens that can weigh down your spirit just when it should feel most free. Think about what your life might look like without these 5 burdens. Imagine waking up with a sense of possibility rather than limitation. Picture yourself engaged in relationships that energize rather than drain you. Envision pursuing modified versions of long-held dreams with creativity and joy. Consider making decisions based on wisdom and values rather than fear and avoidance. This is the liberation that awaits on the other side of letting go. As we've seen through stories like Helen's, Peter's, and Josephine's, releasing these 5 things doesn't diminish your life. It expands it. It doesn't erase your past. It honors it while making space for your present. It doesn't ignore reality. It helps you navigate reality with greater resilience and joy. The question isn't whether you can afford to let these things go. The question is whether you can afford to keep carrying them. If you're wondering where to begin, start with this simple exercise tonight. Take a sheet of paper and draw a line down the middle. On one side, list what you're holding on to that still brings you joy, meaning, and purpose. On the other side, know what you're carrying that consistently creates heaviness, frustration, or limitation. This honest inventory is your first step toward a more peaceful, joyful life after 70. It doesn't require dramatic gestures or radical changes. It simply requires willingness to examine what you're carrying and ask whether it still serves the person you are today. Remember William, who began retreating from life after a minor fall. 6 months after our work together, he sent me a photo of himself at his grandchild's outdoor graduation. "Still using my cane," he wrote, "but I'm there, really there." That's what this journey is about. Not perfection, not denial of reality. Simply being fully present for the life that's still unfolding. A life that remains rich with possibility when we have the courage to set down what no longer serves us. As you move forward, be gentle with yourself. Change doesn't happen overnight. Release one small burden at a time. Notice how it feels. Build on that experience. And remember the words of 94-year-old Claire, whose peaceful presence inspires everyone around her. The great privilege of this age is finally understanding what matters and having the wisdom to let go of everything else. Thank you for joining me on this exploration. I'd love to hear which of these 5 areas resonates most strongly with you, or what you've already begun to release in your own journey after 70. Please share your experiences in the comments below. Until next time, remember that it's never too late to lighten your load and expand your joy.